Reunions are a time to sit back and reflect on how things have changed. Whether it's a family reunion and you're catching up with family, or it's a class reunion and you're noting changes in your former classmates, it's rare to find something or someone that is exactly the same as it was before. What can be said for people can also be said for cities, towns, and regions. Whether it's the economy, migration patterns, the climate, or any range of factors, the city you live in and those around the world are constantly adapting and changing. In this lesson, we'll explore the basic geographic evolution for our neighbor to the north, Canada. In Canada, just like in the United States, there's a constant push and pull between urban areas and rural areas. Generally speaking, urban and rural populations differ economically, demographically, and politically. Beginning with the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, people began leaving the countryside and moving to cities to take jobs in industrial manufacturing operations. Perhaps nowhere else than in Canada is this transformation more pronounced. In 1851, when Canada was still a conglomeration of British colonies, only roughly 318,000 of Canada's 2.4 million inhabitants lived in cities or other urban areas, about 13%. Only 50 years later, in 1901, 37% of Canadians lived in cities or towns, and by 2011, that number stood at a whopping 81%. Nearly all of these cities are situated within 100 miles of the U.S. border. For example, Canada's largest city, Toronto, sits on the shores of Lake Ontario, waters both the U.S. and Canada share. Much of Canada's urban population sprang up around industry or other centers of economic activity. It comes as little surprise that Canada's two most populous provinces, Ontario and Quebec, are also the country's manufacturing and industrial heartland. In eastern Canada, large urban areas like Halifax, Moncton, and so on tend to be on the coast, as most of eastern Canada's economy depends upon fishing and shipping. Urban areas in the interior of the country, when not centered on manufacturing, are centered on areas of resource extraction, such as the Alberta oil fields north of Edmonton. Of course, just because more than 4/5 of Canada's population lives in urban areas does not mean there aren't any farms. Far from it. Canada sports one of the world's largest agricultural sectors, exporting wheat, beef, and other agricultural products around the world. Though farming is still a big part of life in rural Ontario and Quebec, much of this farming is done on the Canadian prairies. Created by the rain shadow of the Rockies, which holds up storms and other weather systems, these enormous grasslands look very similar to our own prairies in the United States. Also similar to the U.S., the rich soil beneath the Canadian prairies is ripe for agriculture. 80% of Canadian agriculture occurs on the prairies. Though the area is relatively sparsely populated, the thousands of Canadian farmers who live there produce enormous amounts of wheat, soybean, and dairy and beef products. The prairies are less amenable to the growth of fruits and vegetables. These, like tomatoes, apples, and other crops, tend to be grown in smaller quantities on farmland in southern Ontario and Quebec. So productive are the grasslands of the Canadian prairies that nearly 95% of the prairies have been converted from their native grasses to farmland. While this has created an incredibly productive agricultural region, it has also dramatically changed the landscape. Many of the owls, coyotes, bears, and small mammals that once roamed the Canadian prairies freely are now either protected or endangered in this area. While urban areas and heavy manufacturing dominate much of the Canadian South and most of its prairies have been converted to farmland, much of the rest of Canada is still uninhabited wilderness. After all, if 90% of the population lives within 100 miles of the U.S. border, that leaves literally thousands of miles from the Pacific to the Atlantic and all the way north to the Arctic for only 10% of the population to cover. When you consider that Canada's population is only roughly 35 million, less than the state of California, that's quite a big ask. Much of this uninhabited land is covered by Canada's expansive boreal forests. These northern forests stretch from the Yukon all the way across Canada to eastern Quebec and even its rocky Atlantic island, Newfoundland. These predominantly evergreen bands of forests are some of the last remaining untouched wildernesses in North America. They support an astonishing array of biodiversity, including over half of North America's bird species alone. North of these untouched forests exists another type of wilderness, the Canadian Arctic. Remaining snow-covered for most of the year, the Canadian Arctic and Arctic islands are similarly sparsely populated. The untouched wilderness of the Canadian Arctic faces a tough task if it is to remain untouched. the Canadian Arctic is increasingly being viewed as a source for industrial development, either through drilling for oil or through new Arctic shipping routes. Just like the family members who change after you haven't seen them for years, regions and places change too. Canada's cities, forests, and prairies are no different. For example, Canada was once a predominantly rural country, but after only 150 years of industrial development, over 4/5 of the country now live in urban areas. These cities generally cluster along Canada's border with the US, and the largest population centers are in southern Ontario and southern Quebec, in Canada's manufacturing heartland. Canada's western prairies, stretching from Alberta to Manitoba, produce much of Canada's agricultural output. Meanwhile, the vast majority of the country, from the northern boreal forests to Canada's Arctic islands, remain largely uninhabited and untouched wilderness.